Good evening. Welcome to the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society's evening presentation of Lynn Cohen, who will speak about the Cohen family of reserve mines, Nova Scotia, on Wednesday, May the 26th, 2010, at Agudath Israel Synagogue in Ottawa.
How do we know if it's working? Could I have your attention, please? If everybody will take a seat, we can start with our program. Okay, I think we're now ready to start. My name is John Holzman. I'm the president of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight on behalf of the Society for the Ben Karp Memorial Lecture, which will be given tonight by Lynn Cohen. I just want to, before I introduce Lynn and have her introduced, I just want to bring everybody up to date on some of the activities of our society. Most of you, I'm sure, know that we had a book which was written about the Jews in Ottawa called A Common Thread, which we launched in October. We've sold quite a few hundred copies of the book. We've given quite a few copies of the book away. But if anybody still wants to buy a book, they can. We've got some here tonight who are available for sale. They're $35 for the soft cover and $50 for the hard cover. You can also order them through the Jewish Archives in the JCC. Also, another program that we are ongoing with us is at the Jewish funerals on Cuba. We tape all the eulogies and give a copy to the family of the eulogies that were done at the funeral. We also send a copy to the archives, and they keep a copy so that there is a record, and these things can be used if people want to get any more information. We also distribute to every bar and bar mitzvah child at all the synagogues in the city a copy of the book, so they will then understand the history of the Jews in the city of Ottawa. I just want to also remind you that 4 weeks from tonight, on June 23rd, we have another lecture by Alan Racco, which is on the Jews of Winnipeg, I guess, and when they came here from after the Second World War. So that brings pretty well everything up to date for you. I'd now like to call upon Barry Karp to introduce our guest speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, The Ottawa Jewish Historical Society and the Karp family are honored to have Lynn Cohen open the 2010 lecture series with the compelling stories that make up the fascinating history of the Cohen family. Having grown up in Ottawa, I can honestly say there were many moments in my life where I would bump into a Cohen. Whether at shul, dances at the old JCC, or at camp in the summer, there were always a Cohen in my life. Now, I'm not complaining. Not at all. I have always been inspired by the determination, the imagination, intelligence, flexibility of every Cohen I have ever met. I never stopped learning from a Cohen, and that's spelled with a C, not a K, by the way. Tonight, we will hear the multi-talented Lynn Cohen, a journalist, a lawyer, a writer, a comedian, a storyteller, and here tonight, launching a new career as a family historian. She will tell us the history of the Cohens. Lynn has spent much time working closely with her cousins, delving deeply into the roots of the amazing family. And through Lynn's lecture this evening, we'll present the moving picture of the intriguing chapters of the Cohen story, from their roots in Lithuania and Poland to the small community of reserve mines in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and finally their move to Ottawa. Believe me when I tell you, the Cohens have a lot to teach us. Ladies and gentlemen, Lynn Cohen.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. As they were growing up in reserve mines, Nova Scotia, in the early 1900s, the members of my family, the Cohens, certainly never imagined the horrific events that would happen to their relatives in the Maritimes and in Europe in the decades to come. They were preoccupied with their hard-scrabble lives in the rural town, helping each other and the struggling coal miners who were their neighbors and customers at the general store they ran. Fleeing the Tsar and repressive government, the remaining Kikon family, who were to change their names to Cohen later, came to the New World. Instead of moving to Montreal or Toronto or New York, like great swaths of Jews were doing in those days, my great-grandfather, Yechiel Kikon, came to Halifax Harbor, then moved east to Cape Breton, then to the craggy shores of Glace Bay. The first in the family to actually arrive in Nova Scotia from Russia were Yechiel's daughters, Chaya Bailiff and Fanny, in 1895. Even earlier, his second oldest daughter, Sarah, had already traveled the Atlantic and settled in New York City. In 1902, after Yechiel's wife, Rachel, died, he himself came to Canada, bringing with him the last of his 6 children, my 22-year-old grandfather-to-be, Moish, Moish's younger sister Lena, and his 13-year-old brother Sam. And after not too long, Lena and Sam would follow their older sister Sarah and live in New York. Upon arriving in Canada, Yechiel soon helped his children legally change their name to Cohen, though he himself kept the name Kikon, which appears on his tombstone in the tiny Glace Bay Jewish cemetery. It might be an exaggeration to call turn-of-the-century Glace Bay a thriving Jewish community, but it eventually became a small, bustling Jewish center. By 1927, some 90 Jewish families, many of them quite large, had settled in the coastal town, which had a total population of more than 20,000. Sadly, the Glace Bay Jewish community soon began its slow decline, as virtually every Jewish child from the area grew up and left the rural coastal town for Canadian or American city life. Indeed, the local synagogue that opened in 1901, Congregation Sons of Israel, closed in the early years of the 21st century. If he was religious in Russia, and I'm pretty sure he was not, Yechiel ended up not terribly observant in Nova Scotia. As a new immigrant, he likely found life in general difficult enough. Yechiel died in 1913 at the age of 69, but he proudly spent part of his later days living alone in a small shack on Brookside Street. Finally, his daughter and her husband, Fanny and Bernard Green, convinced him to spend his final months with them, crowded into their small home with their 4 children. Before I go on, I want to give special thanks to one of Yechiel Kekon's great-granddaughters, my first cousin, Judith Kalin, and her husband, Dr. David Kalin, for their invaluable help in preparing this talk, and especially a project they undertook starting 30 years ago. They spent countless hours putting together a comprehensive family tree in honor of their son Michael's bar mitzvah in 1984. This family tree, with names, dates, birth and death dates, marriages, professions, even divorces where necessary, is about 7 feet long by 10 inches wide and includes some 150 family members. It is a treasure and a gift. You can see it pinned on the wall this evening. Yechiel's oldest daughter, Chaya Bela, quickly changed her first name to Rebecca to sound more Canadian. She married Hyman Brody, who himself was the first Jew to arrive in Glace Bay in 1890. There was nothing unusual about turn of the century, 19th century Jewish girls marrying in their mid-teens. This was certainly true in parts of my family. For instance, Yechiel's daughter, Fanny Green, had her first child, Arthur, when she was only 16 or 17. The young ladies in those days were known to have all the physical and mental prowess needed to raise lots of children and run a household, even a business if necessary. 100 years ago, most children grew up fast, and they took their responsibilities seriously. From current-day Bialystok in Poland, Moshe's wife-to-be and my grandmother-to-be, Sophie Weinberg, left her 7 sisters and 1 brother and her parents and came to the New World at age 16. The excited youth was brought over to work in a New York family, the Brodys. Yes, the same Brody family into which Rebecca had married in Glace Bay. Sophie's original plans were to start her adventure by being an au pair in the Big Apple, then to settle there permanently. But for Sophie, things worked out differently, as they often do. In Sophie and Moish, Rebecca and Hyman saw a match made in heaven. 4 years after Moish's arrival in Nova Scotia, Sophie traveled there to meet him. The meeting went well. They married in 1906. She was 19, he was 26. Leaving New York behind forever, Sophie prepared to settle down and raise a family in the considerably less cosmopolitan coal mining village of Reserve Mines, current population about 2,000, and at that time boasting only 1 dirt road. In 1906, the Cohens were the only Jewish family living there, and since then, not a single Jewish family has ever lived there. Though Reserve is only several miles outside Glace Bay, which itself had a Jewish population of only 488 in 1931, it must be known that in 2001, at a 2001 reunion of some of the 400 Jews who left Glace Bay, the Cohen descendants were heartily teased about being outsiders. Being from Reserve, did we really belong at a reunion of the Bay crowd? Why did Moish and Sophie choose Reserve instead of Glace Bay? Maybe it was the welcome they received in the tiny village. According to my cousin, Dr. Stephen Cohen, who lived in Glace Bay till he was 12, and who learned this from his father, Louis. When the Cohen family first settled into the house behind the store in Reserve, they discovered they were living across the street from the town's Catholic church. The family later learned that the priest at the church told his entire congregation that a nice Jewish family had moved into the neighborhood and everyone should support them. It went both ways. According to Stephen, the Cohens had one of the very first cars in Reserve, and the Cohen boys were expected to drive anybody in town with an emergency to the hospital. Says Stephen, Dad once drove a lady at double speed to the hospital. She subsequently had triplets. One of Dad's major concerns was being forced to deliver babies in the car and messing up his car. Enough cannot be said about the phenomenal strength, energy, and innate business sense of Sophie Cohen. Her husband Moish, presumably like his father Yechiel, loved to learn Torah and Talmud. So while Sophie ran the general store, on credit as it turned out, as her customers almost never had much money, while she baked daily in her own family oven enough of her famously delicious and popular cakes to sell to just about the entire town, while she weekly beheaded and plucked chickens bred in their backyard coop, while she milked the family's few cows every morning before anyone got up, while she cared in every wifely and motherly way for her husband and their growing energetic brood of 5 boys and 2 girls, and while she scrubbed her small house and outhouse until they sparkled, Cape Breton legend has it that Moish simply sat all day and learned. When Moish wasn't studying Jewish law, he was teaching himself English by reading newspapers, particularly the sports sections. Non-religious though he was, like his father Yechiel, Moish looked and sometimes acted the part of the observant Jew. For one thing, Sophie kept a kosher kitchen, so the family ate according to Jewish law. Moish grew his beard, studied Talmud, and walked 6 miles every Sabbath to the Glace Bay Synagogue and back home in time for one of Sophie's delicious lunches. And was Sophie deeply loved by her children and grandchildren alike. In my child's mind, says Stephen, Bubby was there only for me. Much later I realized she was likewise centered in all of our family's minds. Special in my mind, Stephen continues, is the memory of when a rooster jumped on my head. Bubby killed him and cooked him up for dinner. My older cousins were lucky to spend time in reserve before everyone moved to Ottawa. My cousin Judy has wonderful memories of reserve. Every summer until I went to camp, my father and sometimes my mother would take me and my brother Howard to spend a few weeks at the home in reserve mines. Those are the best memories, when my brother Howard and I and my cousins Ira, Paul, Stephen, Joel, and Linda would spend the summers playing in the Nova Scotia town. The old house across the street from the large church seemed gigantic, but when I visited in later years, it was actually pretty small. The front part of the house was the store, which at that time was being run by my dad's brother Joe and sister Rosie. I'll never forget the potato sticks. We were allowed to choose something from the store each day, and the salty potato sticks were my choice. They were delicious. We spent our days at the park playing and picking blueberries. Linda and I were especially close. I remember my grandmother Sophie plucking feathers from the chickens. There was a chicken house and a horse. We kids would collect eggs. I have no memories of my grandfather Moish, as I was too young, but I well remember my Uncle Sam. He would give me a penny for every gray hair I picked out. I wasn't too keen on this game, but those were wonderful times. My cousin Ira also recalls those summers in reserve. Every summer till I was 12, my mother Ethel, brother Paul, and I went to reserve mines for about 3 or 4 weeks. My father couldn't go because he had the automotive store in New York, and there was no one else to manage it. Those visits to reserve were really special to a city kid who never saw a farm, much less a general store. Our hosts were Grammy and Pop, as we called them, along with Rosie and Joe. At that time, Rosie was a school teacher and Joe minded the store. Joe knew where every item in the store was, and he was liked by all the customers. It's funny the things I remember about the store. I remember the smell of the fresh oranges, each wrapped in green paper, and how I'd have one every morning. We had just picked eggs because they also had a farm behind the house with a horse, a few cows, and lots of chickens. The store had heavenly chocolate milk in glass bottles. Actually, all drinks were in glass bottles. I can't remember the name of the chocolate milk, but I had a few every day. One town over in Glace Bay, Rebecca and Hyman had 7 children, including the youngest Molly, who they raised but who was not their own. By 1941, all of the kids were grown and gone, including 3 who became successful New York dentists and 1 who became a New York psychiatrist. Early one evening in June of that year, the elderly couple, Rebecca, 67, and Hyman, 77, were murdered in their kitchen. As they sat drinking tea and discussing their busy day, a man crashed through the always unlocked front door and shot them dead. Hyman Brody was found with 3 bullets in him. The killer turned out to be one of their tenants, a police officer. The murders shocked all of Cape Breton, probably the entire province of Nova Scotia. The story of the Brody double murder is actually memorialized in a slow-moving but beautifully enrapturing movie called Bay Boy, starring a most innocent, sweet, and devout Catholic teenager played by one Kiefer Sutherland. It's beautiful. Hyman and Rebecca had rented a room to their killer, Sergeant Arthur Frost, an anti-Semite and a local police officer with access to the only handgun in town, the one used to shoot rabid dogs. He was 8 months behind in his rent, and the elderly Brodies told him to pay up or leave. This gave Frost the chance to put his latent plan into action. An ardent supporter of the Nazis, Frost believed it was only a matter of time before they attacked North America via Glace Bay. In those days, the idea that North America would fall prey to the enemy was not entirely ridiculous, given the progress the Germans were making throughout Europe. Frost was immediately caught, put on trial, and found overwhelmingly guilty, in the words of John Avnet, the producer of fried green tomatoes and a Brody relative by marriage. Frost's sentence? Hospitalization. He apparently suffered an epileptic seizure sometime in his life, and he did, after all, have hemorrhoids. After a mere 9 months in hospital, he was released, free to live the rest of his long life relaxing in Glace Bay. The Brodies are buried near Rebecca Brody's father, Yechiel, in the Glace Bay Jewish Cemetery. Before 1941 was over, my own grandparents would suffer another tragedy, though this one thankfully did not end in a family member's death. It was the fatal dormitory fire at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick in December 1941. It was my father Goodman's first year away from home. In the wee hours of the morning, one very cold day, Goodman and 8 of his college mates were awakened by the fire and the screaming of others in the building. The group raced to the closest stairway, but it was completely blocked by smoke. 9 or 10 of them ran back into my dad's dorm room. The rest spread into other rooms, slamming the doors behind them to give them more time to decide how to escape. Many years later, my dad told me, "I remember thinking, I'm not going to die tonight." Tragically, 4 of Goodman's college mates did die in the fire that night. I don't like to brag, but my dad was the hero of that fire. And don't take my word for it, the Glace Bay News section of the December 18th edition of the Sydney Post Record said it first. Its headlines announced, "Heroism of Goodman Cohen praised by youth. Reserve youth helped companions to safety. Eyewitness relates heroic act of Goodman Cohen." As the students panicked, Goody kept his cool. It was his idea to tie all the bed sheets together to use as a rope to lower out of the 4th floor window. This was hurriedly done under Goody's apparent calm supervision. When completed, the makeshift rope was lowered out the window, and one by one, the boys used it to escape. Goody helped tie the end sheet to a bed, and he also helped anchor it. Then he encouraged and assisted each frightened friend through the window. When the second-to-last student was lowering himself, the rope tore near the top. Alone in the room, with no longer enough sheets or time to make another rope, Goody stared out the window to his friends on the ground some 35 feet below. Already, dozens of other students had jumped from 2nd and 3rd story windows. They had also watched a boy too frightened to jump from a 4th floor become engulfed in flames and die. With his friends calling to him, Goodman stared out the window, almost frozen. They had grabbed a blanket and they were holding it out at each corner like a circus net. With little hesitation but full of fear, he jumped. He fell through the freezing air with his eyes closed. Finally, he hit the edge of the blanket, then bounced onto the hard ground, back first. He heard a crack, which happened to be his back breaking. He was required to spend a year in hospital in Sydney before returning to school. There is no doubt that his older brother Louis's decision to start a volunteer fire department in reserve mines had something to do with his youngest brother's near-death experience in the fire that cold December night. Just before I talk individually a little bit about the Ottawa Cohens, I want to say a little bit about my Cuban relatives. Very little is known about my grandmother's, Sophie's, family in Poland. We do know that about 80 of them were murdered in the Shoah, and that one of them survived by moving to Cuba in the 1920s. Sophie's one brother, whose name and age are lost to history, had a daughter, Chayenda, in 1905. She married Yosel in the 1920s. Like many young people, they decided to move to the U.S. soon after they married because rumor had it the streets were paved with gold. However, because of quotas for Jews, they could not get into America. Therefore, Yosel, who went first across the Atlantic, settled in Cuba for what he thought would be a very short stay until he could legally get into the United States. Well, he fell in love with Cuba and sent for Chayenda about a year later. She also fell in love with the warmth, the beautiful beaches, and the freedom from anti-Semitism. When they entered Cuba, they were assigned new Spanish names, Jose and Clara. The Cuban authorities were not going to bother with Yiddish. Their last name was Scrandy. They ran a dry goods store in Placentas and had two children, Gutman in 1926 and 7 years later, Rosita. Gutman, born 4 years after my father Goodman, were named after the same relative, Sophie's grandfather, or my great-great-grandfather, who lived somewhere in Eastern Europe. Clara in Cuba and her Aunt Sophie in Nova Scotia kept up constant letter writing in Yiddish to each other, while they both kept up constant letter writing to relatives in Europe. These were always chatty letters about the weather, the harvest, business, who was marrying, new babies, and who died. Clara lovingly devoured news about her large extended family back in the old country. Then suddenly, sometime after the Nazi invasion in the late summer of 1939, the letters stopped. Clara and Jose were well aware of the worsening bigotry toward Jews throughout Europe in the late 1930s, even before the Nazis marched into and took over half of Poland. Like most Jews who were actually living in the hatred, they did not believe the Nazis would do more than decree temporarily, increasingly ridiculous and irritating social and economic restrictions against them. After all, anti-Semitism had been an everyday part of life for centuries. It was painful, scary even, but often not fatal, and never that surprising. In 1941, no one believed the war would end with the massacre of 6 million Jews. Soon after the letters stopped, Clara in Cuba and Sophie in Nova Scotia became very frightened indeed. It was several years before they knew the whole truth, and when they did, Clara experienced a kind of shock from which she never recovered. My mother was traumatized, explains her daughter, Rosita, who lives in Maryland. It was terrible. She could not speak about what had happened. Rosita wanted to ask her mother about life in Poland before Cuba, but her mother would get too upset. My Cuban relatives would have been lost to our family for sure, if not for the incredible character of my Uncle Dave. Born in 1918 in reserve and the second youngest of the 7 Cohen siblings. He was already married and living in Ottawa with a young family when he decided to take a trip in 1953 to Havana, Cuba, to meet his first cousin, Clara. He traveled with an Ottawa baseball team, actually, which at that time was playing a Havana team in the same league. According to Clara's daughter, Rosita, Dave came to Cuba because he was a very caring person. My mother, if she had won the lottery, she would not have been as happy. She and my father were so thrilled to meet him. He became very close to us. One last point about my Cuban connection. In Havana, where Gutman studied to become an accountant, he became friendly with a fellow student, Fidel Castro. A few years later, based on the faulty advice of Gutman, who himself was being deceived, my father and Uncle Dave sent money from Ottawa to help Fidel Castro overthrow the authoritarian capitalist Fulgencio Batista. We all know what happened following the revolution, after which my dad and uncle sent more money to help the Scrandies flee Cuba to the United States in 1961. Like many upper-crust Havana families, they got out in the nick of time before Castro closed the borders permanently. Okay, getting back to the Cohens. My grandparents, Sophie and Moish, had 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. My dad was the youngest, born August 28, 1922, about 16 years after the oldest, his sister Rose. Following Rose, there was a child every 2 years, Sam, Ethel, Louis, Joe, then 4 years later David, and then 4 years later my dad, Goodman. Before I sat down to write this talk, I wrote to all my cousins and my sister, and just about all of them, including my sister, sent me back the funniest and most heartwarming stories about their parents. First, I'll talk about my Uncle Dave. Though he was the second youngest, David Cohen, once he became an adult, was by any measure the leader of his family and the most influential in many of their life decisions, for example, on where they decided to live. His entire family, except his independently minded sister Ethel, followed him here to Ottawa. Probably more than any youngster in reserve mines, Dave could not wait to get out of the stifling rural town. Though he thought the United States was the greatest country, and though he often dreamed about settling somewhere south of the border, it seems events conspired to send him to Ottawa and keep him here. When war broke out, he joined the army, but he never was sent to Europe. Instead, he was sent to Ottawa around 1939. He never saw battle, but he was badly injured in a local occupational accident. He fell through the roof of the cattle castle at Lansdowne Park. He was hospitalized for 1 year. Later, he married an Ottawa girl, Queenie Levin, in a tiny ceremony in May 1942. Soon after, he bought a small shoe store on Bank Street. Legend has it, he was driving by one day, saw a for sale sign, and he bought the store. The rest, as they say, is history. In his daughter Judy's words, "My father always worked in sales. He owned 2 shoe stores, Vogue on Bank Street and Judy J. Shoes on Spark Street. He later expanded the shoe stores and partnered with his brother Sam to include 3 Ansoni shoes on Rio Street, Elmville Acres, and Hampton Park. My father was a very smart business person and always said he would rather have gone into manufacturing shoes than sales. And he was way ahead of his time. Before big box stores, he believed that the best shoe business would include a well-priced and stocked self-service wholesale shoe store where customers could choose and try on their own shoes. What do we have today, folks? According to Dave's youngest, Stanley, unlike his brothers, Dave was not such a great athlete. Once, when I was about 8 or 10 years old, says Stanley, my brother Howard, Dad, and I were throwing around a baseball in front of the house. Dad slid and fell one time after lazily running. He exclaimed after getting up, "That's it, I've had enough." He never came outside to throw with us again, ever. However, it must be said that, contrary to the impression left by this story, Dave played hockey with the Glace Bay team, and he was a long-time avid and successful golfer. By any standard, Dave was an excellent employer. Some of his employees stayed with him for decades. They loved him, and he loved them. He bought one of his workers a car as a gift. Which brings up another point. Uncle Dave was incredibly generous. He made sure all of his siblings who needed help were set up in businesses so they could be self-sufficient. He included Sam in many of his business transactions and was responsible for getting Sam the Metropolitan shoe store in both the Sparks and Rideau Street franchises. When Goody and Rita, my parents, settled in Ottawa to be near his brothers, Uncle Dave bought them their first car and their first television. I'm pretty sure my parents never paid him back. Says daughter Judy, he was very close to his siblings and would do anything for them. When he traveled, which was not often, he would always include them, taking along with him Sam and Sylvia and Ethel and Eddie. When Goody was dying of prostate cancer in 1989, Dave took him on his last road trip throughout New England. Truly, Dave could not do enough for people. Judy says, he was a good, loving father and grandfather. When my daughter Miriam was 12 months old and hospitalized at CHEO for a dislocated hip, he was heartbroken and would visit with her every day, just sitting by her bedside. He didn't want to leave. I believe he was with her more than I, her mother, was. When Dave's siblings died, their children, his nieces and nephews, became his children too. It's very true. Dave was not much of a disciplinarian. His son Stanley explains it this way. Oh, when I was about 10 or 12, a police officer rang our doorbell. He was responding to a complaint by a neighbor about me throwing snowballs. I was terrified when I saw this giant step inside and ask to speak to a parent. I woke Dad up from his usual evening nap. He and I stood there listening to the cop giving a stern lecture. Then Dad said to him, and I paraphrase, "Where did you learn to speak like this? You had to have had really good training to speak like that." The officer looked stunned and muttered, "Never mind how I sound. You need to speak to your son." Well, after the cop left, I lay quietly on the carpet near Dad, waiting for the punishment. Guess what? He never said a word. He just fell back asleep. Like my father Goody, indeed all the Cohen siblings, my Uncle Dave had no strong religious feelings for much of his life. After he got married, he did not keep kosher. He wanted his kids to experience Christmas, so every Christmas Day he took the three of them to Mrs. Hick's place, the home of one of his longtime employees, where she always had several gifts for each of the kids. One year, Dave even put up a Hanukkah bush at home. Of course, Dave's family also celebrated Jewish holidays, but usually with his wife Queenie's sister's family. Then, when his mother Sophie died in 1957, Dave said Kaddish for a year, and he became a little more interested in Jewish life. The main turning point for him was when he and Queenie visited Israel in 1967. He became a strong advocate for the state. He supported the JNF and other organizations financially. In later years, he was very happy to be in Florida during Christmas holiday season, as he came to dislike the Christmas time of year. Indeed, he loved the Jewish life in Florida. When his daughter Judy married David Cohen and started keeping a kosher house and observing all the Jewish holidays completely, Dave loved participating. He even came full circle and kept a kosher kitchen in Florida so the Kalins could visit him comfortably. Even before he was mildly religious, Dave was incredibly wise. As patriarch of the family, with the patience of Job, and never, ever complaining, Dave understood long before self-help was popular that a positive attitude was everything in life, and he led by example. Everyone in the family went to Dave for advice on finances and lots of other issues, and almost always he was right. One last thing about Dave. Later in his life, he golfed every single possible day at Rideau View Golf Club, right into his 80s. Indeed, as long as he was golfing, all who loved and cared for him knew he was healthy and fine. Now Rosie and Joe. I'm discussing these siblings together rather than individually because, though neither of them ever married, and though Rosie was the dictionary definition of spinster, they were kind of like a bickering married couple. Back in reserve, as Sophie was aging and her health was failing, she realized that she had to move to Ottawa with Rosie and Joe. She knew if she died in reserve, those two would never leave on their own. So Sophie closed up and sold the store in reserve, and the three of them, with lots of help from Uncle Dave, moved to Ottawa. After a brief time on Friel Street, they all moved into the roomy apartment on the northeast corner of Gladstone and Metcalf. All three of them lived there till they died. Sophie in 1957, Joe in 1969, and Rosie in 1990, after almost 35 years in the same apartment. My cousin Joel tells me Rosie and Joe almost never talked. Joe was crusty, Joel says, and he'd make a face behind her back whenever Rosie talked. But Rosie was always happy, always pleasant. I'd say she was even cute. You can check some of the photos at the back and decide for yourself. Rosie looked after Joe's health, injecting him with his needed insulin every day. She also complained quite constantly, if pleasantly, about Joe to her other siblings. According to Stephen Cohen, Joe was a trucker for a while in Nova Scotia and a great bridge player when he came to Ottawa. But really, Joe was a hometown boy with health problems. Joe not only had diabetes, he suffered with scoliosis, and he was very stooped. I remember little about Joe, as I was only 12 when he died, but I'm proud of him. Joe, who was handsome, smart, kind, funny, and warm, as well as a life master bridge player, decided not to marry because of his health problems. He did not want to burden a wife, so he chose to be single. I think that was noble. With his brother Sam, Joe played bridge a few nights a week, and they traveled to play too. They were both life masters. Based on tournament points, this designation by the American Bridge League is no small feat. At that time, the rank was the highest any bridge player could achieve. Joe was quiet, especially if Rosie was around. This may harken back to reserve, where Rosie taught in the one-room schoolhouse. From everything I can learn, Rosie's qualification for teaching school was that she finished high school. I believe she taught most of her siblings, which may explain why most of them never went much beyond primary school. That's right, unbelievably, most of the Cohen siblings did not finish high school. According to Stephen Cohen, Rosie also played piano at the social dances above the Brody store in Glace Bay, although I'm sure she was home by the time the Saturday night fights broke out among the drunken coal miners. Rosie talked non-stop. In the words of my cousin Ira, Rosie was different from the other Cohens. She was very outspoken and a strict disciplinarian. We all know she wasn't really that way, but that's the impression she gave. She read everything she could get her hands on, and she'd always clip out items from the paper if she thought one of her brothers might be interested in it. Hilariously, she talked about cooking and recipes all the time, but she never cooked. This was irritating to Dave's wife, Queenie, and to my mother, Rita. Rosie was extremely thin because she ate very little. When Rosie moved to Ottawa, her sister Ethel in New York would cook up a storm for her visits to see her, mainly chicken, so Rosie would have some home-cooked meals. Rosie loved being with people. When she and Joe had the shoe store on Elgin Street for about 10 years, which her brother Dave set her up in, she loved interacting with all the people who came in, just as she had while working at the store in Reserve. The Ottawa store was right beside the Mayflower on Elgin and Cooper. Rosie and Joe schmoozed a lot with Ernie Peteshin, who worked nearby. Conveniently, both Rose and Joe walked to and from work every day. As my New York cousin by marriage, Lois Goodman, writes, Rosie brought some of Reserve Mines to the shoe store she ran in downtown Ottawa. I was quite surprised to see a big, huge barrel with a real checkerboard on it when I entered the store. Rosie never got her driver's license, and she always walked everywhere. Every day, even in her 80s, she walked from her apartment on Gladstone to local grocery stores, including the Loblaws on Isabella or the IGA on Elgin, where she bought bread and vegetables that were on sale. Did I mention Rosie was a miser? To a degree most people will never see, and for no apparent reason, as she always had enough growing up in Reserve, Rosie never spent a dime she didn't absolutely need to spend. She never took a bus, let alone a cab. Indeed, Dave almost certainly bought her her first television, then her brothers together bought her a color TV in the late 1980s. It was even later than that they had to buy her a window air conditioner because she would never buy one for herself. She must have survived on less than $10,000 a year, but when she died, she still had every penny her parents left her, and they left everything to her, nothing to her 6 younger siblings. This bequest had increased substantially through Rosie's savvy investments. Due to her mother's insistence, Rosie sent every niece and nephew, all 12 of us, $10 and a card on our birthdays, even long after we were married with our own children. Don't get me wrong, Rosie was quirky, but she cared deeply about her growing family of nieces and nephews and their children, and we all loved her dearly. Like her mother before her, writing to her niece in Cuba, Rosie wrote constantly to her sister Ethel in New York. I remember she always had a letter out on her little table in the process of being written. It got mailed once a week. Long-distance calls were almost never happened because they, of course, were too expensive. She never tired of hearing what everyone was doing. Being older, she was like a grandmother to me and my sister and brother. We visited almost every Sunday, and our reward was a Hershey's chocolate kiss. Judah remembers her family picking up Rose on Sundays for a drive around Ottawa. Rose loved to be invited for dinner, and her relatives were always amazed at how much she could eat, as she was very thin. It's possible that she was starving most of the time. Ethel shopped in New York for Rosie and sent her food and clothing. She never bought anything for herself. She wore the same dresses, never pants, for 50 years. It drove David Goody nuts. Now Ethel Cohen. My cousins Ira and Paul and their wives, though they never lived in Ottawa, were about the most prolific writers when I asked for information on their parent Ethel. I couldn't leave her out just because she didn't settle here with all her siblings, and I wouldn't want to. She was resourceful and loving and never stopped caring deeply for her growing Ottawa family. She married Eddie Goodman, no relation to my dad, a New Yorker, and settled there to raise her 2 boys. I will let them tell you about her. Ira wrote to me. Mom decided Glace Bay wasn't for her, so she packed up after graduating high school and relocated to Brooklyn. She lived with Lena Rakowski. Remember Lena? She came over to Canada with Yaheel.
And assigned me to collect the money and Gedalia to do certain things.